Hello, and welcome to the SharePoint Framework and JavaScript Special Interest Group biweekly meeting. It is January 18th, 2018. I am Patrick Rogers. I'm very happy to have everybody here on the call with us today, and all of you who might be watching this later. As always, we want to start with a quick overview of what these calls are in case you're new to the calls or new to watching the recordings. So these special interest group calls are part of the larger SharePoint Patterns and Practices program, and they were developed because, frankly, we were a victim of our own success, and the program had grown enough that we weren't able to cover all the areas on the monthly calls that we wanted to cover anymore. So what we did is introduce these special interest group calls. You're on the one for client-side development and SharePoint Framework. As well, we have one for the CSOM PowerShell development practices as well. Welcome, of course, to attend as many of these as you would like. And the idea is we can dive a little bit deeper into these topics. And in our case, that's going to be an open discussion around the SharePoint Framework and the client-side development patterns associated with SharePoint Framework and with developing client side in SharePoint. So that might be not in the SharePoint Framework. It might be more traditional ways through script editors and things like that. We try and cover all the various client side methods, but with a focus on the new SharePoint Framework. And then as well, we talk about the JavaScript core components or core libraries that we're developing here in Patterns and Practices together with all of you out in the community to help enhance everyone's SharePoint client-side development life. The idea being we can all make everybody's work a little bit easier and a little bit better by working together and sharing what we come up with. So two links there on the bottom of the slide. The first, the AKMS SPPnP-community, that's going to take you to the Microsoft Tech Community site, which is a great place to post general questions, general SharePoint development, asks, how do I do this or that? Could somebody look at my code? Those sorts of things that aren't necessarily perhaps related specifically to one of the libraries or to SharePoint Framework necessarily exactly, but just sort of more general questions. A great forum for that. One thing I want to say is all of us have a lot of channels in our lives, the tech community being one, Twitter and Gitter and all the other things. So sometimes we'll miss your question. We're absolutely not trying to ignore anybody. Please never think that. But do feel free to tag myself or some of the other core team members if it's been a couple of days and you haven't gotten a response in the tech community. Because frankly, sometimes there's just so much going on, we just miss it. And it's not on purpose, and it's not us trying to ignore you. And so just wanted to sort of say that out loud, because I know sometimes questions get missed and folks might feel that we're ignoring them, and that's absolutely not our goal. So just feel free to tag us if it's been a couple days, or even in the initial question, be like, hey, Patrick, or, hey, Erwin, if it's a PowerShell thing, something like that. We're always looking to help. It's just we got so much going on, we don't always catch everything right away. The second link there, AKMS SP Dev Docs, takes you to the official SharePoint documentation, development documentation, and that's something that's a constant state of improvement, but it is what we have now, and that's going to cover SharePoint Framework. So if you're looking to get started in a SharePoint Framework and are new to that, please check that out. But as well, it's going to cover more classic SharePoint development patterns, so provider-hosted applications, full trust code, things like that are all covered in that documentation. So check that out, and of course, like everything, always looking for feedback on improving the documentation along with everything else we do. So what are we going to cover today? Vesa is out on a well-deserved vacation, so hopefully he is relaxing somewhere and enjoying a nice bit of sunshine. Unless he's back in Finland, then it's probably cold. So we're going to do a quick update on the JavaScript client libraries, talk about that. We've got an update on the Office 365 CLI, an update on the reusable client controls, and then we've got 3 great demos for this call today. I'm really excited to get these community demos in. We've got Kyle Schaefer, who's written a tool called SP Engineer. We've got Luis Manez, who's he's done a field customizer, which is very cool. And then Frank Cornu has done an SPFx bot extension, which is also very cool. So 3 really cool demos today. I'm excited for you folks to all get to see these. And then we may or may not have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A, but we'll do our best, of course, to answer questions in the IM window and such as we go. So before we get to the meat of the call, I always like to talk about opportunities to participate in patterns and practices, and specifically in this special interest group. The best way and my favorite way for folks to participate is to demo on this call. So join our call, demo your work on this call. It really benefits all of us. We all get to learn from each other, and I frankly, personally, I'm excited to see what folks are doing out there with SharePoint Framework or with the patterns and practices client-side libraries. So you can demo really any kind of client-side SharePoint work you're doing on the call. All you have to do is get in touch with myself or Vesa, and we will get you on a call. One thing I do want to say, we can't always get you on the next call. It might already be full on the agenda, but we will get you on a call if you do want to do a demo. So please just reach out to us. I think it's one of the more valuable features of these special interest group meetings. The next way you can contribute on GitHub. So methods to contribute on GitHub, of course, are submitting feedback, questions, issues. If you find bugs in the code, or you think you found a bug in the code, please let us know. Or submitting code. So if you see an issue that you can fix, please submit a pull request for that. One of my goals for the next year is to do a much better job of getting more issues in the list from my roadmap that have help wanted tags on them, so folks have a better way to see ways they can easily jump in and help out. So that's one of my goals, to help people get involved on the coding side, and so try and keep me honest on that. But really, any kind of feedback we get, and that's sort of the 4th point there on the right side of the slide, any feedback we get, whether it's on the libraries, whether it's on SharePoint Framework, whether it's on these meetings or the documentation or really anything, we always appreciate and look at that feedback we get from folks. We can't always act on it immediately, and we won't always necessarily do exactly that piece of feedback, but they all are appreciated and they all are looked at and reviewed at by everybody on the team. So we take that stuff very seriously, and we definitely encourage you as much as possible to give us any feedback you have. We are here to listen and want to take that feedback. So that's some ways to get involved in the special interest group or the Patterns and Practices program overall. We're going to move now, do an update here on the JavaScript core components, or we're going to sort of expand this title to be the client-side libraries. And what this is now going to cover is we've got the scoped libraries, so the @PnP scoped libraries. I said I was going to do a release on the 15th, which did not happen. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But I did release what I called an RC0, so a release candidate 0, which is basically going to be the code that gets released at GA. So that's out there. So you could do npm install @PnP sp, and you're going to get that release candidate 0 and be able to try that out and use that ahead of what I hope to be the release on the 22nd. The delay is with Vesa being out. He's the one that has access to publish to the main Office Dev blogs where we want to make the release announcement. So the blog posts are written, everything's ready to go, and once he's back next week, we'll get the release pushed out and get that through all the channels so folks know. But I did want to invite folks, do check out, we've got the updated docs site at pnp.github.io/pnp. You're going to get to see my amazing website design skills in play there. I used Blue, which is very exciting for me. But do check out the docs. Obviously, the design could use work, but also very interested in feedback on the content of those docs. So want to improve that as much as we can. So if there's things missing or things that could be said better or examples that could be included that would really help, please just let us know. And that's something we want to build up a backlog of and work to improve those as much as we can. So again, great pieces of feedback from the community around the documentation. For the SPFx JS library, did a 3.04 release on Monday, had some new features and fixes. That was all based, again, on the feedback and the issues folks reported, features they wanted to see. So do keep all that feedback coming. And I wanted to call out, there's 2 issues in the list right now that are more discussions. One is around large batch handling and possibly adding some support to the library for that. And the other is around baking in a method to get all items in a list in one call. So it'd be web list get all items or something similar. So join those discussions. Let us know your thoughts if you have use cases for either of those. That really helps us understand the need for those methods and the value in building those out, and also helps us craft the best way to build those out to help support those use cases. So again, keep all that great feedback coming. I did want to talk about a little bit today. One of the questions I think it was Kenny on Twitter asked me, and we've gotten before, that why would I use these client-side libraries? Why would I bring these into my project? And so I wanted to kind of cover that and talk about that a little bit. Sort of my thoughts on that, and then this is another place if folks have questions and want to continue this conversation, I absolutely would love to do so. But really, one of the main things for me is it encapsulates the underlying REST complexity. So you think about if I just want to do a GET request to a list, there's no complexity there. That's very easy. You just put the URL and do the request. But when you start to do these posts and start to add items and these sorts of activities, you really have to understand what the JSON structure you're going to send and all these sorts of things. And we've tried to encapsulate all that. So you can just add a method with a plain object, or add an item with a plain object, things like that, and not necessarily know exactly what's getting sent back and forth to the server. We've tried to surface that and smooth that out, as well as smoothing out a lot of the differences when calling it in verbose or non-verbose mode for the OData and things like that. So a lot of the work, like if I was starting a project, I would do, we've tried to do for you so you can take that work and just run with it. The second point is a repeatable development pattern. And this is something, especially for large organizations, if you've ever been on really large projects, which I imagine most of the folks on this call have, having a repeatable pattern that folks can use and build on is really valuable. And that's another source of value for these libraries, is we're trying to give you a repeatable pattern to use in your application. So that way if you're developing one piece and you move over to look at another piece maybe somebody else has done, it's more immediately obvious what's been going on and you're able to kind of pick that up a little bit easier. The other place I like to point out is really great is what we've done is extensible and fairly lightweight. We've just sort of wrapped the REST APIs around with that Fluent API, with that Fluent interface, and all our objects are extensible. So you can take those exported objects and create your own custom webs or lists or items within your applications built on sort of our base to handle sort of the junky plumbing, and then build your business objects on top of that. So that's a big point for me, is that we easily allow you to build what you need to build on top of the work we've done. We've got examples out there on that. We could certainly have more, and we'll work on improving those examples, but that's another big point for me. And the final point I think is really valuable and sometimes is undersold, is that all of this work is community driven. So if you have ideas for enhancements or things that would make the libraries better, we want to hear those and we want to improve. So whether you want to submit a pull request so we can get your code put into the library, which is fantastic, or you just want to sort of say, I've got this idea for an enhancement if somebody else wants to work on it, also fantastic. But that idea of community driven means we all get to benefit from all of our ideas and work. So it's not just something, the Patterns and Practices core team is just putting out on our own. It's really all of us as a community building this together. And so I want to, like I said, one of my goals for next year is to really encourage more people to get involved on the coding. Russ has a question. Where do we get feedback on the documentation? There's a link at the bottom that says, I forget exactly what it says, but it says something about create an issue, and that'll actually should actually open up an issue with the title already populated for that page's path. And you could, yep, that's the one. And just give us any issue suggestions there, and we'll start building a backlog on the documentation stuff. And as we've talked about on some of the other calls, the docs are right there next to the code now. So I think that process is going to be a lot easier than having to then separately go update the wiki every time. So we'll see how that works. I think it'll be a little easier. We'll see. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about why using the libraries is valuable. So again, encapsulating the complexity for you, repeatable development patterns, that extensibility and sort of our light touch without forcing you really to do things. Yeah, so other reasons, Bill's got IntelliSense and strong typing. We've tried to type as much of the SharePoint API surface as we can. And then as well, that community-driven aspect that I think is really valuable. And at the end of the day, as Russ says, this really is working to save everybody time and let all of you as developers focus on what you want to do and maybe not the nitty-gritty of how to do each task, but just know I want to add an item, call add an item, done. So anyway, like I said, let's continue that conversation if folks would like. Would love to help folks understand the value I see in the library and hopefully the value others see in the library. So stepping into the Office 365 CLI, want to do an update. Got these bullet points from Waldeck yesterday. And so there's a new beta out, 0.5.0. It's got more commands for managing site design, site scripts, sites, lists, and custom actions. Some great contributions from Velen, Robert, and Daniel. And they contributed some new functionality, some of those commands, and then as well minor bug fixes and improvements are in that beta release. And again, if you'd like to contribute to something the Patterns and Practices program is doing, the Office 365 is another great place you can jump in, and contribute. Those commands are all fairly atomic, so if you want to write a command, it's fairly simple to write a command and contribute that in. And Waldeck wanted me to share the December 17 stats, so stats from this just last December, obviously. 737 downloads for the month on NPM, 48% Mac, 48% Windows. I don't know what the other 4% would be there. And then 1133 page views on the docs. So some great initial stats, some great initial uptake on the CLI. I think December was the first full month that was out, I think. So really impressive numbers. And if you haven't checked this out, do have a look at the CLI. Some really valuable cross-platform management capability there if you're not able to use some of the PowerShell work. And then stay in touch. So he's got he's following the hashtag Office365 CLI on Twitter. There's a Gitter channel, and as well that link, aka MS0365 CLI, will take you to that Gitter channel. And then the why would you use this stuff? Again, the PowerShell commandlets are currently only available on the Windows platform. So if you're on a Mac or Linux or something like that, or some more exotic operating system, you might be able to take advantage of these CLI commands when the PowerShell wouldn't be an option for you. So now we got an update on the reusable components. We talked about these a little more in depth on the last call, but wanted to provide an update. These are from Elio. He's been working to improve these over the last couple weeks. And for the controls React, he's fixed a file type icon, works in the SPFx extensions. That was a bug that was out there, and he's in the process of working on a rich text editor. I know that's been a big ask for folks, both within these controls and within SharePoint Framework, is rich text editing capability. And so that's Elio's working on that now. I don't have a timeline to tell you, but it's in the process. And then for the property controls, the people picker, you can now pick single or multi-select people based on the settings for that control. And he's working on a code editor property field. So that's similar work to the rich text editor, and that's in the pipeline. If you haven't, do check out the webcast. That's a big link. I'll include that link in the post for this call recording when that goes up. but dev.office.com/blogs/webcast reusable controls for your SharePoint framework solutions, all with dashes. Like I said, I'll include that link in the post for the call. So if you haven't checked out the controls, again, another great piece of functionality from the Patterns and Practices program. You can pick that up, drop that into your applications, and it'll really work to save you, again, some development time and give you those repeatable, consistent patterns across your applications. All right. So like I said, we got 3 big demos today. The first one is going to be from Kyle Schaefer. He's got a tool he's written called SP Engineer. Hello. At this point, our recording of Kyle's demo during the call lost video. So we have gotten Kyle. He's graciously agreed to re-record his demo for us, and we've dropped that into the middle of this video. So this will seem a little disjointed, but this is Kyle's demo, Kyle Schaefer's demo from Thursday, the 18th of January, inserted magically into the video starting now.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Hopefully second time is a charm here. Hey, guys. I'm excited to reintroduce you to SharePoint Engineer, which is a command line tool that we created here at Spiritus to do configuration operations, essentially, in your SharePoint environments. And it's really built to help developers and teams of developers store their configuration operations in source control. They can store it in their code right along with their front-end web assets that they may be deploying to a number of SharePoint environments. And it allows multiple teams of developers to keep those configuration operations in sync across multiple environments. So that's kind of the goal here. And I should note before we start that Engineer is kind of overlapping with several other tools available in the SharePoint space and the Office 365 space. Particularly, you can do a lot of these same operations using things like the REST web services, CSOM. You can do this using PowerShell. You can even do this in Visual Studio by building an app model sort of solution that you can then deploy to the app catalog on your tenant environments. And that being said, we're not trying to replace any of that existing functionality. We're not suggesting at all that Engineer should be the only tool that you use. Rather, we're just trying to create a tool that's adding to our tool belt. And just another option that you can use to consider to do configuration options in your SharePoint environments. And in particular, we really, really love all the great stuff that Patrick and the community and Microsoft are doing in the open source space, in the open source world. And a lot of our staff here utilize a lot of front-end development framework technologies, things like React and REST and JavaScript, ES6 and TypeScript and things of that nature. And we just find that skill set, asking those same staff to step over into the world of PowerShell is sometimes a bit of a stretch. So Engineer is kind of designed to allow those people with the JavaScript and the ES6 background, the front-end development background, to use that same skill set to do configuration operations. It tends to make them feel very comfortable when they're doing this. So that being said, I'm going to show you how Engineer works here really quickly. We're going to jump into the terminal. I'll give you guys a little bit of links and stuff here in a little bit, but to demonstrate exactly what it is and what you can do with it, we'll start by installing Engineer in our terminal, and we're going to do that using the npm command. So we're going to do npm install. We're going to use the -G flag to make sure we're installed globally, and we're going to install the package called sp-engineer. Now what this is going to do is it's going to take just a few moments and install Engineer in our global npm repository. And as soon as that's done, we now have a command called engineer that we can type into anywhere within our terminal, and that's going to allow us to do all sorts of things inside of our projects that we're working with. In this case, the first thing we're going to want to do is set up a new Engineer project. I don't have one yet, so the first thing I'm going to do is just make a directory. We'll call this feedback web part, and then we'll cd into that directory. And you'll see this is an empty directory. There's nothing in here to start with. But the first thing I'm going to do is do an engineer init. What that command does is it creates two files, and we're going to open this up in Visual Studio Code so you guys can take a look at this. And you'll notice over here on the left, the two files are git ignore, which is basically just ignoring the environment file because we don't want to store any sensitive password or authentication information in your source control. And then the environment file itself. You can actually have multiple environment files if you decide to set it up like that. Maybe you have a dev and a stage and a test and a production environment. You can set this up like this, but by default, there's a single environment file. And this is basically just an ES6 module. It's a JavaScript file that's exporting some data that we can then use with the engineer command when we run those commands in this directory. First and foremost, you'll see there's the SharePoint site URL. I actually have a dev site we're going to be using, so let's go ahead and type that in. And then if we scroll down a little bit here, we have an authentication object where you can set the authentication method for connecting to your SharePoint site that you're using. By default, it is username and password. I'm going to be using SharePoint Online on Office 365, so we're going to just use my email and password here. But also, there's a link in the comment here. You can go. This uses a module called Node SPAuth. Which you can actually pass in different types of authentication. So you could use API authentication where you have a secret and a public key. You can use all sorts of different things there, but those are probably the two most common, our username and password and the API app method of authentication, I suppose. So we're going to pause the recording for just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and put in my credentials here. Okay, so we have our password saved into the file there. And the first thing we're going to do is run engineer install. Now what this is going to do is going to install two tracking lists into our target SharePoint environment. If you did have any authentication errors or issues there, you'd see an error message here saying, hey, we couldn't connect to the site. In this case, it did work. You can see it's going through these 6 operations here. It's basically setting up 2 lists, one called engineer migrations, the other called engineer manifest. You guys can read about exactly what those lists do on the documentation on sp-engineer.org, which I'll give you a link to here in just a moment. But basically, they're just tracking lists so that the environment can keep track of what configuration operations have been run. Now that we have engineer installed, we're actually ready to start utilizing it to make configuration changes. Now, the way that that is handled in engineer is through what we call a migration. You can think of a migration as a way to deploy a configuration change. Now, a configuration change could be a whole bunch of things. It could be creating a list, or adding a content type, site column, or adding a column to the list. And it could be a number of things in a single migration, but basically, it's kind of a isolated operation executed on a target environment in order. And this is actually a method we are borrowing, and we're very heavily inspired to create engineer by a tool called Laravel. They have this idea of migrations in the Laravel, which is an open source piece. Not at all related to SharePoint, but they have this really nice way of managing database changes in Laravel. And that's kind of where the idea of engineer came from, is that rather than dealing with a database in SharePoint, we're dealing with lists and site columns and content types and views and things of that nature. But it's sort of the same idea where we're using migrations to actually control those configuration options. So you can get started by creating a migration by running engineer make, and then you basically give the migration a name. So let's go ahead and make a really simple one. We'll call this add feedback list. In this example, we're going to pretend that we're creating a solution that maybe has a feedback web part where users can submit feedback and give a rating about your SharePoint site that they're currently looking at. So this command is going to go ahead and create a file. If we switch back to our Visual Studio Code, you'll see what it did by running that command is it created a migrations folder, and inside of that, it created a time-stamped file that you see ends with add feedback list. The timestamp is actually really important because you will find that in a lot of projects, you may have a migration that creates a list, and then a month later, you may have a developer come in and say, hey, we need to add a new field to that list. Well, you obviously want to make sure that list exists before you add a field to it, and that's how the timestamp comes into play. It's actually keeping track of the order of operation that migrations need to occur. So you can always ensure that the earliest migrations will get executed first. So let's go ahead and open this file. Let's take a look at it. Again, it's just an ES6 export file. You'll see here it's exporting some data, and all migration files are going to consist of two components. They're going to have an up method, which you see here, and a down method. And you can kind of think of those as deploy and retract. Basically, the up method is going to run when you're updating or migrating this configuration, and the down method is going to run when you're rolling back the migration. So it's going to undo whatever is done in the up method. The easiest and the simplest migration that we can create is just to create a list, which actually every time you create a new migration, it's going to kind of templatize it and put in this boilerplate. It just creates a generic list called my list. But in this case, again, we're pretending that we're going to create a feedback list. So I'm going to go ahead and say engineer.web.list.add feedback. And then down here, I'm going to say engineer.web.list.getByTitle feedback.delete. You'll notice that the format and the API structure of the methods that you have available in Engineer very closely mimic what you see in PnP.js core and the PnP libraries that the community and Microsoft has created. And that is by design. We wanted to make it familiar. We think it's a really great way to structure it. And the REST methods already kind of exist there, so we wanted to kind of mimic that. But there's a whole bunch of methods that are available dealing with lists and content types and all that stuff, which we don't have time to go into all of that, but you guys can definitely check it out on the website. There's lots of documentation there. So now that we have this migration all set up, we're all done here. If we actually switch back to our terminal, we can run engineer status, and you actually see it's going to connect to the SharePoint site and make sure that sort of see what the status is of this migration. And it's going to know that because that hasn't been deployed yet, add feedback list migration is now in a pending state. And if we run the engineer migrate command, it's actually going to take all the pending migrations, and in order, it's going to go ahead and push those out to the SharePoint environment. And you'll see it actually ran the migration and added the feedback list to our site here. If we actually run engineer browse feedback, that's just going to a kind of a convenience method that comes with engineer to browse a list. You'll actually see we can open this in the browser, and you see, yes, indeed, it did create a list on this SharePoint environment called feedback. If we run the engineer status command again, you'll see that this is now in the migrated status, so it has been migrated. Now let's do something a little more advanced here to show you some of the other features, but what I'm going to do is we're going to create another migration called add fields to feedback list. And again, let's open up our Visual Studio Code. You'll notice that it created a second file with a timestamp. The timestamps are actually UTC, so even if you have developers working in different time zones, it should always kind of make sure that the order is correct on those. And you'll notice it created this second file that we're now going to edit, but we're not going to do a list here. We're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to get that list that we created in the previous migration, and we're going to go ahead and add a couple of fields to it. So let's delete this part of our up method, and let's say engineer.web.list.getByTitle, and then we're going to get the feedback list, and then we're going to say .fields.add. We're going to get the field collection, and we're going to add a new field to that list. Now, this is the more typical way that you're going to use engineer is actually, previously, we did kind of the shortcut or the simple version where we just created a list and we passed in a string. But usually when you're going to access these methods in engineer, you're going to use the JavaScript object notation, which allows you to give all kinds of options for the type of objects that you're updating or creating or working with. So, for example, we can specify type as multi-line text. So we're going to create a multi-line text field with a title of feedback comments. And you can add things like description, add some comments, whatever it may be. You could add number of lines. And these are a lot of the different things that you have available in the REST API. So you can have all kinds of options that you can pass in when you're creating these things. For example, append only, if you wanted to create that, you could pass in true. In this case, we're not going to do that, but lots of different options when you're creating a particular field. And again, all that's documented in the documentation, so you guys can check that out. Always make sure that you undo an operation, because we have both the up and the down method here. So in this case, we're going get a list by title feedback, and then we're going to say .fields.get by title feedback comments .delete. And then that's going to make sure it selects that field if this migration is being rolled back, and it's going to delete that from the feedback list. Now let's add one more field here just to show you. I'm going to duplicate this really quick. We're going to also add this to the feedback list. Let's create a choice field. One thing that you may remember from working with the REST API or even PnP.js core is that a lot of times when you're working with choice fields, you may have noticed that you have to do some weird stuff with the data. Like, for example, I know from the REST API, I forget the exact format, but I think with choices, you had to pass an object, and you have to do this weird thing where you have __ metadata, and then like type is edm.string or something like that. Like this, just some weird stuff that no developer should ever have to memorize because it's ridiculous. So there are some cases where we differentiate it a little bit from the spec of the REST API, and choice fields are one of them, because we just thought it would be so much simpler if you just very simply pass an array of choices as strings here. So there's a couple of examples where we have deviated, and really we only did that. We were very thoughtful about when we chose to deviate from that, but we only did that when we felt like we were just making the API easier to understand and more convenient. So in this case, we're going to create a couple of different star options that you can choose from. Let's make this one singular there. And then let's add a different description here. Rate your experience. Let's add a little typo there. Okay, so we have two fields, and again, we want to make sure that we also delete the stars, feedback stars thing in the down method, and that's it. That's the end of this migration. So again, we're just adding two fields to that list. Let's go ahead and switch back here, and if we run engineer status, you'll notice we now have two migrations. The second one is now pending, so if we were to run engineer migrate, it's actually going to run those two operations inside of that file, which are add field feedback comments to feedback and feedback stars to feedback. And if we switch back to our browser here, you'll notice we refresh and then click on new item. Yes, indeed, you have a feedback comments field and a feedback stars where you can choose a rating. So that was pushed out here. The cool thing about this, and really the way it was really designed to be used, is that these migrations, if we were to check them into source control, can now be made available to several different developers. And all they would have to do, if they're all working in different development environments, is if they needed to get the latest configuration changes that are going to support the new code, the front-end code and the JavaScript that's running a web part, for example, in this case, a feedback web part, all a developer would have to do was pull changes from source control. It's going to pull in these migrations, and then they just run an engineer migrate command, and it's going to deploy the latest change to their environment. So that's kind of the whole idea behind this, is that because these configurations are being captured in these script files that checked into your project along with your other front-end assets, you can now start deploying them to multiple environments and sharing them across a team, which is a great way to kind of manage it, because everybody's keeping up to date. You don't have to ever manually, tell a developer, hey, I added this new thing. You have to go in manually on your environment, or you have to, you don't have to totally retract a solution and then deploy it again, because you need to make sure that it's all done right the first time. So this is kind of the problems that it's seeking to solve by doing this. Not only that, but now that we have these migrated to this environment, we can run a rollback command, and what it's going to do is it's actually going to go in reverse order of all the migrations, and it's going to undo those. So it's going to run the down method inside of that migration file. So you see in this case, it deleted the two fields and then it deleted the list. And if we were to run engineer browse feedback, not feedback, you'll notice that obviously it's going to be page not found because that list has now been removed. And then very quickly, again, engineer migrate, it's just in a few moments, it's going to go in order and in chronological order and deploy all of those. Even if you have 50 different functions. It'll just very quickly run through those, deploy them all at once. You could then deploy them to a staging environment, with a different command. You can switch environment files on the fly with just a couple commands and deploy all these to all those environments and keep everything up to date. So hopefully that gives you guys a good idea of how Engineer works. It's a quick introduction. I do encourage you guys to check out the website, which is sp-engineer.org. You can learn lots more. It is an open source project, so you can check out the source code. There's a lot of things we'd love to do with this, such as working with taxonomy, working with navigation. There's lots of cool things I think there's an opportunity to plug into here. But for now, definitely check out the migrations API. These are all the things you could work with. Everything from content types to list views and webs and things of that nature. So we showed you a couple of real simple examples, but also one of the things that Engineer does is, for example, with content types, admittedly, the REST API in SharePoint has some limitations when it comes to content types. For example, you can't really pass in an ID when you're creating a content type. It kind of generates a random one every time you create one in the REST API, and that can be an issue because then you have different content type IDs for that content type across multiple environments. So there are some issues with that REST API, and what we do in Engineer is we actually switch automatically between the REST API and CSOM, because there's some things that you can do in CSOM that work better in CSOM than they do in the REST API. And if you've ever had to work with CSOM, you probably want to shoot yourself in the foot because it's pretty awful to work with, at least in my opinion. So we're kind of doing some of that work for you, and we're just kind of putting this abstraction layer over it so that we're work of making sure CSOM works and making sure REST works, but developers are just interacting with this consistent API, works this which method you're utilizing. So that's kind of the whole idea behind it. But again, we'd love to see other contributors jump into the project and help us kind of improve the functionality here. I think there's a lot of opportunity to make this a really cool thing. But definitely check it out. Again, it's sp-engineer.org, and feel free to look into all that documentation, and hopefully you guys see this as a valuable tool and something that you'd also like to use in your team.
Fantastic, Kyle. Thanks so much. A really interesting tool. It's really great to see what folks out there in the community are building, and this is just another fantastic thing for folks to look at and put in their tool belt alongside all the other capabilities that exist out there in the SharePoint ecosystem, SharePoint dev ecosystem. So definitely check this out. And I want a big thanks to Kyle for being willing to jump back on and re-record this after our little recording snafu on Thursday. So thanks, Kyle. Really appreciate it. And now back to our regularly scheduled recording. Wonderful demo by Kyle. Really appreciate it. So similar to the PowerShell, similar to the Office CLI, Office 365 CLI, but then different and taking, again, a different approach. So I think it's always valuable to see these different approaches. So moving into our second demo, we've got Louise, who has a field customizer sample using the Text Analytics API. So this is another really cool sample. Louise, if you are...
Hi guys, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Just a very quick about me section. So I'm Luis Manes. I'm an Office Dev MVP working for a London-based company called Clear People as a cloud architect. And well, you can ping me on Twitter, GitHub, wherever. Feel free to ping me if you like. So let's take a quick look to the demo. So what we have here is a custom field customizer, SPFx field customizer. So what we are doing is rendering this sentiment icon based on the content in the title field. So what we are using here is the Text Analytics API. This is an API coming from the cognitive services. So as you can see here, this is the official documentation. So you can analyze a text using the API, and you can get the different languages in the text, the keywords, and the sentiment score. This is just a number telling you how positive or negative is the text. So coming back into the list, let's do a live demo. So here we have the first item. So it's very happy face, of course, because we all love SharePoint. Let's try to do the same in Spanish. So just saying exactly the same, we all love SharePoint. And in this case, we are having happy face as well, but it's not as happy as in English. And well, I guess that's going to be because most of the SharePoint projects in Spain are still farm solutions. Never mind. Let's try something similar, but with a very bad comment. So I found this interesting kitty toy in Amazon, and surprisingly, not everybody seems happy with this toy. So there's a guy on here that is saying terrible, loud, only works with batteries, and not as cute as it appears. Unbelievable. So let's grab this test and try it on here. Let's see what happened. Yeah, boom. Very angry face, surprisingly. Okay, that's how it works. So before having a look to the code, I would like to explain first how we can query the Test Analytics API. In order to use the API, you're going to first register the service in Azure, in your Azure tenant. So here we are in the Cognitive Services section. So we can create a new service. You have to fill the form and see how there's an API type, because cognitive services are offering a bunch of different APIs related with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. So here you have to select, in this case we are using the Test Analytics API, and some time ago I did another demo showing the Vision API. So yeah, you just fill and click create, and once it's created, you can get the API and use it later. So if we take a look to this official website, the Test Analytics API offers you 3 different endpoints. So you can get the language from a text, obviously, you can get the sentiment and also the different keywords of the test. And you can do a post request to the API. So the body of the request, it looks like this one. There's a document section, so you can post different, what is called documents on here. It's like different tests that you can send with a specific ID. And then to the languages endpoint, in this case, you are getting the response on here. So it's saying, okay, this document with the ID 1 has these different detected languages, and for each language also the ISO name and the score. And this is how sure the system is that the language is English in this case. Pretty much the same with the sentiment endpoint, but in this case we have to provide the language code as well, that we are getting in the demo first using the language endpoint and auto-detecting the language. Just keep in mind that if you are using if you want to use the API, this test on here, the maximum size is 5,000 chars, as you can see. Also, keep in mind that you can send more than 1,000 documents in the same request, so only that 1,000 documents in the same request. And also be careful with the number of calls that you are doing to the API, because if you are calling very fast the API, you can get 429 too many request error as well. So if you call the sentiment endpoint, what we are getting in the response is again all these documents that you sent before with the ID that you passed to the API, and also the score about how positive or negative is the comment, is the text. So let's jump into the code. So what we have is a field customizer on here. So every time the field is rendered, I'm getting the text from the title field and also the ID, although I'm not using this ID later, but I'll show you how. And well, in the event object that you are getting from the SPFx framework, you can call the list item, get value by name, and send the field of the list that you want to get the value. In this case, the field, the title field name is set as a property in the same SPF extension, so we can configure it later and change from title to any other field that we want to analyze. And after that, we just create the main component, React component, sentiment analytics, and we are sending the text that we want to analyze, the HTTP client as well from the SPFx content to do the different post requests to the API, and the API key that in this case is coming as well from the properties. In my previous demo with the Vision API, I configured the API as part of the tenant properties. However, there's currently an issue with the get API in the tenant properties. So if you are running the query with an external user, it's not going to work. You're going to get an unauthorized exception. The issue is actually logged in GitHub and should be fixed probably during this month or the next one, according to Besa's comment. But in the meantime, in this case, we are providing the API key as part of the properties in the feature. So if we take a look to the serve JSON file, you can see here the configuration of the field customizer. This is the field on the list that we are rendering, and here you can see the API key and also the name of the field that we want to analyze. So jumping now to the main React component. So here this is the base URL. First, in the get sentiment function, we are auto-detecting the language based on the test. So we are doing a post to the languages endpoint, and in the body of the request, this HTTP option is from this function. So we are saying, as you've seen in the previous web from Microsoft, the different documents with a specific ID. This ID is just a GUI that I'm creating when the component starts, and the text that is coming from the field in the list. And if we are calling the sentiment, we also need the specific language code, as we'll see in a minute. Also, we are adding some headers in the request with the key API on that one and JSON content type and so on. So when we have the language and the language is coming here, well, we are just submitting one document, so we are getting the response in the first document. The detected languages, we are also getting the first one. Keep in mind that if you have different languages in the same text, you're gonna get an array with the different detected languages. And for each language, there's a property ISO name that is saying like N for English, S for Spanish, and so on. So once we get the language, we are just calling a new post request to the sentiment endpoint, and again configuring the body request, but in this case specifying the language as well and the different headers and so on. And in this case, again, we are just sending one document. So in document 0.score, we are getting the number. This is a number between 0 and 1 with the sentiment. And when the get sentiment function, this is an async function. As you can see, we are using the async and await keywords, and on here, when the promise is returned, we are just updating the React state, the React component state with a specific score, and that means that this sentiment icon component is gonna refresh. And let's take a quick look to the sentiment icon. So this is just what is called in React a dump component. because we get the score from the properties in the component. So we are just translating this 0, 0 or 1 value in a specific icon. And obviously, this is completely up to you. If you want to consider a happy face with everything that is over 20 or whatever, is completely up to you. So finally, the sentiment icon is rendered, and we are getting the result in the screen as we saw. And just to show you the different network traces, let's refresh. Okay. And you can see the different post requests to the languages and the sentiment endpoint. And if you open one of them, you can get the response. So here for this document, the different detected languages with the English code and so on. So I think that's everything from this demo. And yeah, I'm gonna be available in the chat window, and I'm gonna review now if there's any question, and feel free to pin me later on Twitter or whatever.
Great, fantastic, Luis. Really appreciate that demo. Really interesting stuff, and I think it opens up a lot of possibilities with the various cognitive services APIs. So we're real close to the end, so we've got one more demo. Frank, if you are there.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so now the screen. Share my screen. So I try to be quick on this. 5 minutes left. So can you see my screen?
Almost. I got it.
Okay, so hi everyone. So my name is Frank Cornu. I'm a Office 365 specialist and Office Development MVP, and I'm based in Montreal, Canada. So today I will show you a quick example that I've made a few weeks ago about the integration of a bot in SharePoint portal. So using the authentication with MSL, which is the authentication library for JavaScript. And so I will present you first of all the end user experience. So here I have a communication site with SharePoint Online. As you can see, the integration is done via an SPFx extension of an application customizer type. So when I click here, the first thing is the login pop-up. So I have to login in the application. So behind the scene, we use the OAuth2 implicit flow. So I'm already connected. So what I have to do here just to authenticate within the Azure AD. And then, so next, the conversation is started with the bot, and he recognizes me, and I can type some question. For example, who is my manager? Or what are my groups, Office 365 groups? So as you can see, the answers are personalized. So it means that the permission, the current permission of my user are taken for the queries. Behind the scene, this is the endpoint, the graph endpoint. The graph endpoint is called. So basically, the use case of this kind of solution is to provide a kind of assistant in your portal to answer some basic question or automate some basic action within your portal. So what are the building blocks of this solution? So first of all, you will need to register an Azure AD application. So in this sample, I use the MSL, so the Microsoft Authentication Library, targeting the Azure AD v2. This sample works with Adele.js as well, so targeting the v1. But since the MSL is the new library to use, I wanted to try this out. So first of all, you will have to go to the app.dev.microsoft.com to register a new app behind your Office 365 tenant in your Azure directory. So, a few things to comment here. First of all, sorry it's in French, but I hope you understand. You have to check to add a new platform, the web platform, and check the implicit flow, because the solution is based, like I said, on the OAuth 2 flow. Also, about the reply URL, a very important point is to use here the site collection root URL. Why? Because in Azure AD v2 you don't have the wildcard character, so it means that if you integrate your bot within a web part, for instance, in the redirect URL, you will have to add each page URL as reply URL to be able to get this solution work. So that's why I use an extension, because the extension is present in every page, so I can use a single reply URL. So this is the first step. Next one, you will have to use a Lewis model. So basically what we do here is to match some intents with some graph queries. Very simple concept. So this is a very simple example here, but in real life you may want to use more complex intents to automate some action or get more complex data. So here I have get my manager or get my group. So just provide some dummy utterances and you're good to go. So next one. After the Lewis model is set, you will have to create a new bot application. So within Azure. So here you have two choices. You have the web app bot or function bot. Here I use the web app option, but the function bot works as well. So here, when you create a bot, you can just upload the code or set the code of the bot here. For convenience, if you want to use this sample, just open the code in the online editor and paste it directly in the app.js. Maybe in a real-life situation in production mode, you may want to have a GitHub integration or a Git integration to automate your deployment. So the bot code is implemented here directly in the editor. So next, you will have to set up the direct line channel because behind the scene we use the React control, the bot framework web chat React control, which is a control already prepackaged control in React. So it uses the direct line channel. So you will have to create a new direct line channel and get the secret keys. Get the secret keys you will have to put there in your configuration. Okay, and next one in the setting, the application setting. So in the web app setting behind your bot, you have to add the Lewis ID. So you can get those ID directly in the Lewis portal. Okay, the last part of the solution is to store the configuration value for your SPFx extension. In this solution, I use some global configuration. So instead of creating variables directly in the code, I use the SharePoint Online tenant properties. So to do this, I used the PnP command net, so the storage entity command net. So just put all your information here, and they will be retrieved automatically in the SPFx extension. So as you can see, if I switch back now to the code, the first thing I do is to get those tenant properties. So this is so the first thing is to get the entities, so the values directly from the tenant property, and then for the authentication part, so the MSAL part, the code is quite simple. You just have to call the login pop-up to trigger the authentication process, and then give the access token. Then the access token is sent to the bot using the back channel. The back channel is a way to exchange information between your client-side code and your bot code. So and silently, without the user see it. So I send the token via the back channel to the bot. So this is an event type, a special event type. So when the user is authenticated, I send the user token to the bot via the back channel. So if I go back to the bot code, we'll have the associated event here. So I get the access token and I store it inside the storage context of the bot. So to do this, you have multiple options. So in this sample, I just use the memory bot storage, which is a temporary storage for test purpose. But in a real life situation, you may want to use an Azure table, Cosmos DB, or other to implement your storage. So once I store the access token in the special private conversation data property, I will be able to use it directly in dialogues in the session object. So if you set up your dialogues within the bot, you can, in the session object, get your private conversation data and the access token. And when you have the access token, you will be able to make graph queries according to the current permission. I didn't talk about permission, but in Azure AD V2, you don't have to set up your authorization in the app. You can set your permission directly in your code and dynamically. I will show you. So let's say I want to make some basic queries. I will have to set up some scopes, what we call scopes. So it's just defined here. So in this sample, I just need the directory read all and user read permission. So I can just specify it here. So depending of your query, the queries you want to make, you have to get the right scopes. So you can get these values directly in the graph documentation. So very simple. So I get the access token and I do the query and send back the result. Just notice that the relogging process is not done directly in the bot, but in the client-side part. So this is up to the MSL library to ensure the user has the right access token. So every time the web chat window is open, the access token is is always sent to the bot. So by this way, I have a fresh token every time. Okay. So the last part of this solution is the conversation history. As you can see, when I click back to the button, my conversation is retrieved. My previous conversation is retrieved. To do this, I just store the conversation ID within the local storage. So in this solution, I have a special event on the bot connection saying when the bot is online. So when the bot is online, I can get the conversation ID and store it in the local storage, thanks to the PnP JS library. So by this way, I'm able to retrieve the conversation ID. And if I inspect the local storage, you can see the conversation here. Why the local storage instead of a session storage? It's because if you use the session storage and if you open another tab, your conversation ID will be lost. You will lose your conversation. So that's why I use the local storage. So it was quick, but I think I explained the whole concept. So feel free to use the solution. This is a very basic example, so you can improve it in your own requirements. And feel free to ask your question if you have. So thank you.
Fantastic. Really great presentation, Frank. Really another super interesting topic. So if you haven't looked at the bot framework, this is a really cool example of using that within SharePoint as an extension. So it's something I hadn't seen before, and another very cool sample that's out there. We'll link to that from the post when we get this up for the recording. Don't have time today for the Q&A. We actually went a little bit long, which is fantastic. Really valuable to see all those demos. Our next meeting is going to be February 1st for this special interest group. Our next general SharePoint development special interest group will be on the 25th of January. That's next Thursday. And until then, I hope everybody has a great weekend. Look forward to talking to everybody soon. Thank you all for your time. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.